Hello, my name is Chint Shepard, and today I'm going to be giving a brief rundown on Japan's history, politics, society, issues, and culture. First, I would like to give a quick geography lesson on Japan and surrounding countries. So, here's Japan. It's a big island nation. We can see that Japan has a larger mainland, but the actual Japan in total has 14,125 islands in total. Here you can see also Japan's largest and capital city, which is Tokyo. Additionally, we can see on this map is Mount Fuji, which is the tallest mountain in Japan, standing at 12,388 feet in elevation. This is famously depicted in the Great Wave, which is a famous Japanese artwork by Hokusai in 1831, and is a part of a larger set of prints known as the 36 Views of Mount Fuji. I would also like to take a quick glance at Japan's topography, as I believe it gives a good insight in where people in Japan live, as Japan's geography is very unique and shows, why lots of portions of Japan are uninhabitable. So here you can see this map. The lighter portions are kind of higher in elevation. The darker green portions are lower. And notice how in Japan there's not a lot of flat area. It's pretty either high elevation or just straight to the sea. And we can get a good idea on where people in Japan actually live because of these mountains if we look at population density map. So here's a population density map. You can see the super dark red splotch there on the bottom right is Tokyo. And if we compare these side by side, then you can see a lot of similarity, which is pretty unique. And now we're going to get into kind of a quick rundown on Japanese history. So the first evidence of human habitation on Japan is the Shiraaho Seonetebaru cave ruins. This is located on the Ishigaki Islands. And while building an airport on this island, remains were found of ancient humans that dated back to 32,000 years ago. There were many periods in Japanese history, but this is the first kind of known habitation. But these periods go in succession from the Jomon period, the Yayoi period, the Kofun period, Asuka period, the Nara period, the Heian period, and the Kamakura period, which this is where we kind of enter the feudal history of Japan. So Minamoto no Yoritomo became the first shogun of Japan. Yoritomo became the first leader of Japan to have military rule when he consolidated power. This is where samurai actually came into existence and power. So he created a specialist force, and this was kind of Japan's military at the time, but they were in charge of inflicting force through power, and the shogun Yoritomo was in power of them. And in 1274 and 1281, the samurai armies were mobilized to fight Kublai Khan invasion on Japan by the Mongol Empire. In both invasions, the Japanese fought the Mongols to a standstill despite their smaller numbers until eventually two strong windstorms called the Kamikaze destroyed the Mongol ships and saved Japan. And here's a really famous artwork of this. Next we have the Azuki Momoyama period. From now into basically present history, there's been just about a million different periods in Japanese history. So for the sake of timeliness, I want to resume this history lesson in World War II. So in 1941, Japan's government was led by the Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo. Tojo wanted to stop the U.S. embargo on Japan through war efforts. So on December 7th, the Japanese Navy launched an attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which catapulted the U.S. into war. Despite numerous war efforts from both parties, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Japanese cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Shortly after, Japan surrendered, and the U.S. basically took over Japan From 1945 to 1952, General Douglas MacArthur basically ruled as the de facto ruler of Japan. He provided reforms to relaunch Japan to more kind of a westernized, um, like in terms of a westernized government and the way it was ruled. A lot of the way Japan has been crafted to this day is based off the U.S. Japan previously was not democratic, but after this, they were reformed into a democracy, and the complete economy and education were also completely rearranged. From this time, a something happened. It's called the Japanese economic miracle. So from 1945, which is the end of the World War II, to 1991, which is pretty much the end of the Cold War, Japan experienced enormous economic growth, as you can see in this graph here. Iron, steel, petrochemicals, electronics, motor manufacturing, and chemical engineering grew by extremely high rates, which made Japan really prosper. So they really grew not only by themselves, their GDP grew, they grew in the world scale. Kind of examples of this is the famous car companies such as Toyota, Mitsubishi, and Honda. After the Cold War, though, economic prosperity kind of began to slow down as Japan became a larger world power. The Japanese government has kind of settled down, and this is kind of launched into the modern Japan as we know it today. So, as terms in government in Japan, the Japanese constitution is actually the oldest unamended constitution in the world, but it is only 7 years old, so that's kind of a fun fact. Before the war, the Meiji Constitution was used, but it was obviously reformed post World War II by General Douglas MacArthur. The Meiji Constitution was around for a very long time. It established restrictions on the early emperors of Japan, and it allowed the country to be a little more civilized, which also gave the country lots of legitimacy. Japan's government is obviously a democracy, as we have learned at this point, but more specifically, they operate under a parliamentary system. So this is different than U.S., as the U.S. is a presidential system. More specifically, Japan works very similarly to the U.K. actually, as they have a prime minister, and instead of a king, they have an emperor. So the emperor of Japan serves as the figurehead of the state. Similar to like the UK history, the emperor used to be the one who had all the power, but today the emperor serves more as, like I said earlier, like a figurehead. They don't really have much of a role in governing. The emperor of Japan today is a gentleman named Naruhito. That's what he looks like. Pretty cool. Currently, the prime minister of Japan is Fumio Kishida, who serves as the head of the executive branch. Japan has an executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch. It's very similar to the U.S. Power is separate, and there are implemented checks and balances for each branch. The Prime Minister, being the executive branch leader, has a term limit of 4 years or fewer. The Prime Minister can be removed from office if the Japanese House of Representatives believes it. But here I should quickly mention that the Japanese government is composed of two different legislatures under something called the National Diet. Here's a picture of the National Diet area, and there's inside. The National Diet is composed of the lower house, called the House of Representatives, and the upper house, called the House of Councilors. Members of both parties are voted from a parallel voting system, and this is just like a first past the vote system with proportional representation for parties. Here is a quick list I just pulled from Wikipedia of popular Japanese parties. You can see here the Liberal Democratic Party, the Constitutional Democratic Party, Japanese Innovation Party. There's all sorts of interesting parties. As far as the judicial branch goes, the highest court of the land in Japan is the Supreme Court of Japan. Pretty unique name. It is very similar to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they interpret the Constitution. As far as Japan's military goes, Japan has the Self-Defense Forces, which are also known as the Japanese Armed Forces, which is their unified military. With a $53.1 billion yearly budget in USD, the Japanese Armed Forces are fairly powerful, with almost 250,000 active members, almost 1,500 aircraft, 1,000 tanks, and 155 naval boats. The military headquarters is in the Ministry of Defense in Tokyo and is a part of the government. As far as military goes, it's actually quite interesting in Japan. So, in Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, it actually outlaws war as a means to settle international disputes involving the state. So, this means that Japan is not allowed to go to war according to their own constitution. This is pretty problematic, actually, because, as we just discussed, Japan has a really large military. Japan says this is the minimum level of military needed for self-defense, but that number is obviously controversial, as what's the minimum number that you need for self-defense? And this is a highly debated topic in Japan. I would also like to discuss civil society in Japan. Recently, as time has gone on, civil society has been increasing in Japan. This is most significant in NPOs, or non-profit organizations. We can kind of see examples in this. So I want to talk about the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster in 2011, which was the most severe nuclear disaster after Chernobyl. There has been a large anti-nuclear power movement in Japan. Really active civil society against anything nuclear power. There's been large groups formed, like the Citizens Nuclear Information Center, and several others, like Women from Fukushima Against Nukes. As far as policies and issues go, Japan, one of the larger issues that Japan faces is climate issues. So as you can notice, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, there was a massive shift away from nuclear power in Japan. Because of this, Japan became a lot more reliant on fossil fuels. In turn, this makes Japan one of the top 10 greenhouse emitting countries in the world. Recently, there's been a large push among civil society and NPOs and other groups to tackle climate issues in Japan. Unfortunately, Japan has to walk a fine line between not using fossil fuels, so they are not emitting lots of CO2, right? But also not using nuclear power. Makes it really tricky. Japan is especially subject to climate issues because of its island nature, right? A lot of Japan's largest cities, like Tokyo, is only 131 feet above sea level. So this makes them really subject to climate change and rising sea levels. And as far as Japan being a part of the Big Six AP Comparative countries, my short answer for this question is no. The government is not that unique, as it was pretty much built by America. And although they are parliamentary, their parliamentary system looks almost exactly like the UK system. So although Japan has a widely rich culture and a unique history, they do not provide enough uniqueness to be in the AP CompGov Big Six.